Our next speaker is Dr. Andrew Sowder, who will be speaking about U.S. foreign policy perspectives and international assistance. Dr. Sowder is a physical scientist at the International Security Non-Proliferation Bureau at the U.S. Department of State. He's also an advisor to the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation. Dr. Sowder.
Okay, while we wait for the computer to be set up, I just wanted to give a brief introduction in terms of what my talk is going to cover today. In the previous presentations is an excellent lead-in because what I'm going to discuss is, first of all, from the point of view of the United States as a major player in providing the path forward for Chernobyl in terms of assisting with the development of the shelter implementation plan, but also coming up with a way to pay for such a large and complex project. And all of this, of course, is not possible without adequate political will. Is this forward? Okay. So, again, a lot of the previous presentations have already discussed the accident in great detail, so I won't dwell on the accident, as well as the starting point, which is the sarcophagus. But what I would like to discuss with you today is the international response, and again, I'm going to focus today on, of course, the shelter implementation plan as a technical response, and the key element of this was an agreement between the government of Ukraine, the G7 nations, as well as the European Commission in 1995 under a memorandum of understanding. This memorandum of understanding set forth a path for the eventual closure of all the Chernobyl reactors, and also provided for mobilization of grants and loan packages to provide, among other things, path forward for the shelter implementation plan. And a key element of the plan is, of course, again, the funding and the oversight. And this is provided through an assembly of donor nations within the Chernobyl Shelter Fund. And finally, I just wanted to wrap up with a progress report on where we are today, especially given this being the 20th anniversary. So in perspective, I don't need to dwell on the fact that 20 years ago, a new word was added to the global lexicon or language. In essence, Chernobyl now has taken on a broader meaning of really being synonymous with some great disaster. But one of the interesting questions arises if you look at all the information on when international assistance began and loans and humanitarian assistance on large scale. It's apparent that there was a delayed international response in terms of actually being able to provide assistance. And one of the main factors is, of course, the accident occurred in the Soviet Union during the last days of the Cold War. But there was a fair amount of technical cooperation, and again, my colleague Gordon Fowler of the NRC will be discussing this in a little bit. So the first exchanges, as is often the case, is among technical and scientists, et cetera. And there was quite a bit of that in the end of the 1980s. However, large-scale assistance from the international community did not begin until after the collapse of the Soviet Union and beginning in earnest in early 1992. And just by way of perspective, on the side of the U.S., since 1992, U.S. government assistance has essentially mobilized over $800 million in humanitarian commodities to Belarus and Ukraine. Now, much of those commodities themselves were actually donated materials, but the use of U.S. government aircraft and funding of the transportation, et cetera, from the U.S. Made that possible. And again, it's always important to keep in mind where the money for this comes from. And in terms of the U.S., the Freedom Support Act was passed into law in 1992. And of course, this gave the appropriations that form pretty much a large portion of the U.S. contribution to Chernobyl programs. Again, quick reminder that this happened in the Soviet Union, but it was an international event, as plumes really don't know boundaries. And even though the accident predates the IAEA International Nuclear Event Scale, which is essentially like the Richter scale for nuclear accidents, it came in as the poster child of the major or most severe accident at 7. Again, the timeline, you have already gotten a good handle on this, but really it's interesting, and it really speaks a lot to those who responded immediately after the accident in terms of the effort, that by November 15th, the sarcophagus was constructed. So that gives you an idea of, from June to November, such a major construction project being initiated and completed speaks to really the challenges and why the shelter or sarcophagus is in the state it is in today. So here is the looking from Unit 4, the destroyed reactor end of the Chernobyl Units 1 through 4 complex. Gives you a perspective of what the site looked like after completion. But the reason why there's a shelter fund and a shelter implementation plan is the state of the sarcophagus today. And the word water, of course, made me thirsty. But again, as Daria mentioned in the previous talk, that upon completion of the structure, there was still about 1,000 square meters, and that's an enormous size, of openings for water and wind and the elements to enter the remains of the damaged, destroyed reactor. So in essence, a less than ideal shelter, but again, understanding it was built under extreme circumstances. And the picture on the lower right of the screen shows you a view from the inside of the existing sarcophagus. And it's not a good idea to be able to see daylight, and that much daylight through the shelter. So that gives you an idea of really the state of the shelter today. So post-accident, the sarcophagus was really built as a temporary remedy. It's not permanent by any means. And this is due to the fact that the rapid construction under the extreme conditions, on top of structures that you're unsure of their stability, and because of not being able to weld or bolt components together, it's extremely susceptible to collapse due to earthquakes, as well as even possibly heavy wind loads. And of course, water intrusion. It's not a good idea to have water in contact with your radioactive materials if you want them to stay in place. Now, also following the accident, and it was alluded to in the video, the other reactors were brought online as soon as possible. So units 1 through 3 were put into operation again because, well, the Soviet Union and Ukraine needed the power. And one thing to keep in mind is units 3 and 4 have many shared components and structural elements. So should there be a collapse in Unit 4 of the sarcophagus, you can imagine what that would do to the operation and safety of the neighboring reactor. So this is really the meat of, in terms of foreign policy, the motivating factor and really what allowed for progress to be made in terms of dealing with the sarcophagus and the remains that are entombed therein. In 1995, in December, as part of a G8-led process, the government of Ukraine signed a memorandum of understanding with the G7 and the European Commission for a very high-level sketch of how to go about closing all the remaining operating reactors at Chernobyl by the year 2000, while dealing with the negative consequences, of course, for Ukraine and economically, socially with those closures, while also recognizing that something needed to be done with the remaining reactor. And I'll just mention quickly that Unit 2 was shut down in 1991 following a severe turbine hall fire in the facility. In 97, Unit 1 was shut down, and in the year 2000, Unit 3 was permanently shut down. So I think one thing to keep in mind is it took incredible willpower on behalf of President Kuchma and the country as a whole to go about this shutdown. In return, there were funds and loans made available for reforming and the power sector, the industry, which at the time was not very good about collecting on bills, etc., as well as investing in new forms of energy. And of course, in forefront of everyone's mind is nuclear safety and also decommissioning of the destroyed reactor. And I just realized I didn't advance it. Okay, so here we are. And then finally, there were also funds made available for dealing with the social impacts, consequences of shutting down the nuclear power station, which at the time still employed a large workforce. So now linking up with the previous presentation, essentially in '97 was developed as an outgrowth of the MOU process, an overarching plan to move forward in terms of transforming this Unit 4, including the sarcophagus and the remains of the reactor, to an environmentally safe condition. And essentially, this involved building the shelter over the shelter, which would provide not a permanent solution, but certainly a platform from which to safely then go about deconstructing what was left behind. Now, a key element of the shelter implementation plan, again, is how to pay for it, and that will be really the focus of the remainder of my talk. Now, of course, politically, it's important to know how much is expected of you, and the initial target cost was $758 million at the time. And I put the word target in there because it's very important. As was mentioned, at the time of this shelter implementation plan, they didn't even have an idea of what was going to be done. So it's very hard to come up with a true cost estimate when you don't even have a design in mind. And finally, the SIP was broken down into a number of major components, and including stabilization, which is very important, as well as the new safe confinement, which is actually what the new shelter is known as. Moving forward, and this actually, I just started work at the State Department in 2003, and my first trip was to Slavutich to participate in one of the regular donor assembly meetings there to review progress and to prove high-level decisions on the program. And at this meeting was the first time that we were presented with a conceptual design for the shelter. So this is when that arch design was first really officially presented as the final approved plan. But again, specific details still remain to be worked out. That's up to the contractor who wins the bid. So, there we go. So you can imagine, to our surprise, when we got the new bill, it now came in at just over $1 billion. And that's quite an increase until you take into consideration that the original $758 million figure really predated any conceptual design, did not include common items in any kind of a a true cost estimate such as risk and inflation. And actually, if you back calculate for inflation, it's not too far off in $1997. And of course, given the complexity of the project and a number of delays, the project timeline had slid, I believe, to 2008 from the original target date of 2005 for completion. Which brings us to today, and I just want to give you a quick progress report. And to just start off with, the difficulty in working on this project is, of course, people constantly want to know, so what have you done for us? Especially many of you as U.S. taxpayers, and I'll go into how much the U.S. has provided so far, but let's see some pictures. And unfortunately, for most of the project, there isn't a lot to show in terms of big structures. That comes at the very end. So it's kind of a challenge to keep people motivated and avoid donor fatigue, et cetera, when a lot of the projects, very important projects such as stabilization, aren't as visible, and construction of the infrastructure and things. So that's one of the challenges, is keep reassuring people it's coming. You know, the shelter is coming. You'll see the result. So to date, as an update, the construction is essentially either complete or nearing completion on key support facilities. You can't perform this kind of construction without facilities in place. And again, Daria went over these, and I won't belabor them. But essentially, these and other facilities and structures and support programs are expected to be operational in time for shelter construction. So that's the good news. And again, there are tangible examples of progress, as was shown. One of the key components, of course, is making sure that the sarcophagus doesn't collapse when you're trying to build something over it. You have a lot of workers on site, and you can imagine what a second catastrophe that might be. So stabilization is really another key element that I think is often overshadowed and forgotten, and is another major component of the project. Stabilization is, in fact, progressing, and completion, I believe, is expected in mid-2006. Now, on the new safe confinement, who was awarded the contract. Obviously, it's important to have the contractor start work so you can complete the project, and I would give you as a completion date approximately 2009. Okay. There you go. The Chernobyl Shelter Fund is essentially kind of the highest level part of the management structure of the shelter implementation plan, and in essence is an assembly of the donor nations. The Shelter Fund, though, the day-to-day administration happens somewhere else, and it's in fact administered by the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. There is a separate international advisory group to act kind of as a removed, impartial judge of activities. And of course, the ultimate client is of course, the government of Ukraine, and officially the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. And again, the project management unit manages the day-to-day operations on site. And the Ukraine nuclear regulator, though, plays an important role in all of this, because the site and the sarcophagus are actually still nuclear facilities, and they're on the hook to actually license anything that happens there. And you can imagine what a challenge it is for them to try to deal with this one-of-a-kind situation. Now, getting down to the money. Again, funding is of course key, and the first pledging event occurred in 1997 in New York under the U.S. presidency of the G7, Subsequently, additional funds were added in the year 2000 under the German G7 presidency. And a third event occurred just last year in London. Now, the U.S. is the largest single country donor to the Shelter Fund with the pledges to date of $203 million. However, the European Commission is the largest overall contributor. And it's kind of complicated because, as you can see, France, Germany, the UK, and Italy are also members of the European Union. So how you break that apart, I'm not going to even try here. But again, just from perspective, the U.S. is the largest single country contributor. And as a result of the 2005 pledging event, we did top the $1 billion mark, which is good news. But just quickly, there are 24 contributors, and to qualify, I believe you need a minimum contribution of $10 million to the fund. And just last year, the Russian Federation stepped up with $10 million and so became an actual member of the assembly for the first time. So again, major breakthrough in terms of participation from them as part of the G8. Now, the shelter implementation plan is just one, probably is the largest, of course, but one of other activities going on site that have been internationally funded. The U.S. has provided substantial bilateral support from primarily the U.S. Department of Energy for nuclear safety projects on site. There is also another European Bank for Reconstruction and Development Fund, which predates the CSF, that also does essential work focused on more nuclear fuel storage and waste treatment, waste management issues. And the U.S., for instance, has contributed about 30 million, I do this one in euro, out of a total 160 million that has been slated for Chernobyl activities. And just as an example, one of the things that you have to do before you can fully decommission the other 3 reactors is you have to do something with all the fuel. I believe a lot of the fuel remains in Unit 3 because the storage facility on site, the pre-existing storage facility, reached capacity. So, for instance, one of the major projects is to come up with some kind of dry storage for intermediate term storage of the fuel. And I'll close with just give you a sense of kind of a laundry list of ongoing challenges. Again, one of the major issues before fully decommissioning the site is dealing with the fuel, the spent fuel on site, as is with any reactor, actually. Also, though, you have the radioactive waste management challenges on site, of course, that are unique because you have the fuel-containing material remaining in the debris of the reactor and high activity waste in the environment that you wouldn't hopefully not find around a nuclear power plant, and enormous quantities of low-level radioactive waste and soil, as well as miscellaneous liquid waste, including rainwater that has entered the shelter. Doing work on a site involves radiological work conditions, which slows everything down. Funding is always an issue. I guess there's never enough money. And regulatory oversight is a challenge, especially for any regulator, and the state regulator in Ukraine is no exception. Again, these challenges are kind of one of a kind. But again, my colleague, Gordon Fowler, I believe, will speak to a lot of the support that has been provided from the U.S. and others for this unique challenge. Another challenge is recruiting and managing the workforce. And anytime the cost of steel goes up or the cost of concrete goes up, the cost of the project increases proportionally. And yes, this work is being done, paid for by donors, including the Ukraine, but it's all being performed within the Ukraine. So any changes politically, as in the U.S. with any project, major project like this, that's so politically charged, any changes politically or changes in government can greatly affect the schedule. So with that, I'll conclude, and thank you again for this opportunity to speak, and I look forward to answering questions as a member of the panel and afterwards. Thank you.